We have a quorum, and the chair recognizes that a quorum is present, and the investment committee meeting will come to order. Please be reminded that we have muted all participants and listeners to avoid distractions. Before you speak, please state your name, and we appreciate your patience if there arises any technical issues. Please know that we'll try to get those fixed as soon as we possibly can, but help us keep a nice, quiet background, if you would, please. So, Ashley, if you'll call the roll of the members.
Sorry about that. Chair Christopher Zook.
Present.
Keith Brainerd.
Present.
Sherry Shivers.
Present.
Great. Ashley, if you'll provide a list of people who pre-registered to comment.
Yes, today we did not receive any pre-registered public members for comment.
Okay, great. So we will have a motion to entertain a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes that were distributed to everyone the other day.
So moved, Sherry Shivers.
Need a second?
Second.
All those in favor, say aye. Aye. The ayes have it, and the minutes will not be read. The minutes are approved as circulated. So we'll jump right into it with Kenny. Kenny, if you'll deliver your report to us, please.
Thank you, Christopher. Good morning, members. First, we have a quick report on compliance. Just as a reminder, the first evaluations were due June 1st. We were expecting 55 evaluations that covered 62 different plans. We also received 2 evaluations from systems that have just under $30 million in assets. At the moment, we have received all but 5. We have had an opportunity to communicate with those who have not had a chance to submit one yet. Both Denton and Harris County Hospital District have indicated that theirs should be arriving shortly. Corpus Christi RTA and Nacogdoches County Hospital have indicated they've had some issues with significant COVID delays. Corpus Christi RTA is still in the middle of their RFP process, but they're hoping to have it done by the end of the year. Nacogdoches County Hospital had reached out indicating that they're having difficulty finding a vendor. So we were able to provide them with a list of different vendors who have completed ones, and we also directed them to Taxpers, who maintains a list of potential vendors. So hopefully they will be able to find one and get that done as soon as possible. And then Midland Fire has indicated that they are still working on theirs, but they have not provided a time frame yet as to when to expect their evaluation. So let me know if my audio continues to have some issues. I'm trying out some new headphones here, so we'll see if this works better.
I can hear you.
All right, Ashley, we can go on to the next one. So we'll move on to 5B and 5C, which is a draft of our investment performance report and some discussion of recommendations that we have created from various discussions. Ashley, you can go ahead and go on to the next page. So just as a quick reminder, one of the requirements within the new state law is that the PRB compile and summarize the information and submit that information in the form of an investment performance report. So we want to kind of go through some of that today, what it looks like, what we're expecting it to look like, some of the information we plan on including. We have provided a general outline of what we expect the actual report to look like. So we'll go through, obviously an executive summary, provide an overview of the law and the things that we have discussed in our last meeting and this meeting with respect to what reports we've received and where they stand. Then we're also going to provide an analysis that we are preparing, kind of looking through various things, and I'll go into more detail regarding that in a moment. That'll be followed by recommendations. The recommendations will include both recommendations to the legislature that the board members will determine whether they want to include those or not. And then also we have some recommendations for potential improved practice for the systems themselves. And I'll go in a little bit more detail into both of those as well. And also we have the compile and summarize piece is mostly going to be contained within what we're calling our evaluation summaries. We have a few examples within the packet, and I'll walk through those as well as we get as we walk through this presentation. And then finally, we're compiling the resources. We mentioned this in our last meeting. We're compiling the various resources that have been identified, the benchmarks or industry standards that the various evaluators are utilizing as a way to provide basically a list of different things that different systems can look at if they want to do any additional research or look at things that maybe their own evaluator have not. So it'll be a document that we kind of put together that allows both the PRB and then any stakeholders that have any interest in learning more about this information. They'll be able to go to that document and get additional information. Ashley, if we can move to the next page. Okay, so just as a general overview, the PRB analysis it's essentially designed to provide kind of a high-level overview of what we're finding in the evaluations. Right, so we have been seeing certain trends running through the evaluation, so we want to talk about that to some degree. In our last meeting, we talked about the recommendations that were being made, so we'll continue that analysis and bring in the additional evaluations that were not included in our original evaluation, so we can see what recommendations are more common, and then kind of hopefully tie that to some of the evaluations that maybe didn't have recommendations, but they highlighted certain things that the plans were doing well. And so there is some common themes between some plans with no recommendations that show, hey, these are the things that they're doing really well, that do tie to some other plans that have recommendations to maybe encourage that. So we'll identify some of those practices and resources that we do think that can be highlighted and useful to other systems as well. And that'll go both in the PRB analysis section, and then maybe in more detail, we'll include that in our resources section. And then, finally, we want to kind of move that into any recommendations that can be made to improve future evaluations. So that kind of works well with the potential legislative recommendations that we want to talk about today. And I'm more than happy, just feel free if you guys have any questions, you want to ask any additional details that we may be thinking of, feel free to jump in, and I'm more than happy to provide additional details if I don't provide enough right now. So actually we can go ahead and move on. So we'll jump right into the legislative recommendations that we've included. Now these are have come out of the discussion that we've had in our past meetings, as well as what we found from looking at the evaluations, looking at the original legislative intent, and then a number of conversations we've had with different systems as they try and navigate how they're putting these together and what's supposed to be included. So I'll go through these real quick. So obviously we've talked about the fact that the legislative intent here was to provide more transparency around how these boards are making investment decisions. And again, we've talked about this in the past. A number of systems have reached out to us, and we've reached out to other systems when we didn't think there was sufficient detail included in their evaluation. So we have had continued conversation about what information really belongs in this report and what we're hoping to get out of that. And as mentioned in our last meeting, we really believe that these reports provide a unique opportunity for a comprehensive overview or review, and also communicating what's going on of all the investment decision-making practices. So what we find is that each of these boards, they engage in their process, but they tend to do it in pieces, right? And so they do it, they do some aspect of it within one board meeting, a different aspect in another board meeting. Sometimes it's difficult to get a really good overall picture when you're not involved in those meetings on a regular basis. So these reports really have provided a good opportunity for the boards, the evaluators, and the boards to communicate how it is that they're undergoing these processes and making these decisions. That really provides a good educational opportunity to stakeholders who don't have the opportunity to be as involved in the meetings. So, and someone new who is interested in becoming involved, it does provide a really good kind of introduction to what is going on that we haven't seen communicated in the past. And so because of all that, the legislative recommendations that we have included in this packet really focus on clarifying what should be included in the evaluation, primarily to kind of make it a little bit more clear as to what kind of information we think is useful to communicate to the stakeholders. So that's really where I think some of the differences that we found is that while the evaluator may be providing the exact same service and doing the exact same evaluation from one client to another or from one evaluator to another, the biggest difference seems to be in the level of detail in which this information is being communicated through these reports. So that's kind of the biggest aspect that we think we're focusing on. Actually, if we can go to slide 20, please. So I should say these recommendations they're numbered 1 through 4. They're not necessarily included in any particular order. This is just the flow that we've put them in. So there's not necessarily an order of importance or anything to that nature. This is kind of how we've organized it. So as I've said, most of these are about clarification. So we had spoken at our last investment committee meeting that we think it's important that regardless of whether a recommendation is made or not, having a clear explanation of the analysis that's being performed and how the evaluator is drawing their conclusion is important to communicate. So this particular recommendation is essentially suggesting that regardless of whether you are making a recommendation or not, there should be an explanation of how that determination is made. And so, we noted during our meeting previously that it was much more common if a recommendation is made that the evaluators may justify that recommendation, so they will provide an explanation. It's simply less common if no recommendation is made. It's more common for the evaluator to kind of outline the process and then make a statement to the effect that they don't necessarily need to make any changes. But there's not really, many times there's not as clear of a line drawn as to why no recommendation is needed or how the existing practices really fit in with what would be considered appropriate. And then also kind of, it's helpful to discuss these within the context of governance structure and fund size, because clearly, what TRS does isn't appropriate for, what Atlanta Fire is doing. This governance structure, plan size have a big impact on what should be considered best practice for these plans. And so it's really helpful for that type of explanation to be included. If there are no questions, then we'll go ahead and move on to slide 21. So this recommendation is more about having a better understanding of who is performing the evaluation. I will say that the majority of the evaluations we received did include most of these things. They did include, the name of the evaluator. The evaluators identified what their qualifications were and how they met the required qualification outlined in the statute. However, we did receive some evaluations that didn't even include the evaluator's name. So there wasn't a way to identify without reaching back out to the system to determine who had done the evaluation, what their qualifications were, and if they met the requirements that are already outlined in statute. Now, clearly, every single one that we reached out to and we asked for more information, they do meet the qualifications, but it's without making that extra step. We think it would be useful to have this information in there, and then that allows the stakeholders who are reading these to have a better sense of who's completing these, as well as what their qualifications are. We've also included something that was requested during our last meeting, and we've added in. So, excuse me. I should note that these disclosures are disclosures that were identified in the guidance for investment practices and performance evaluations that we published last year prior to these being completed. So the majority of these are ones that the board has already identified as disclosures that should be included in evaluations. And then we added one additional one that was discussed during the last meeting, and that was an acknowledgement of potential conflicts of interest, given that the law currently allows for an existing relationship to exist between the evaluator and the system itself. And so again, we just think it's making sure that everything is as transparent as possible. We have a clear understanding of who is performing the evaluation, what their qualifications are, what their relationship is with respect to the system itself. Simply provides all stakeholders the ability to decide, for themselves whether they think that the evaluation is sufficient, or it provides enough information for them to draw the conclusions that have been drawn. If there are no questions, then I will go ahead and move on to slide 22. One of the other items that was noted during our conversation in our last meeting was it wasn't entirely clear how much, if the boards themselves have received these, how much consideration they had necessarily given to these, to the reports themselves. We had noted that every single one generally comes from a board representative, and these are generally reported or presented at board meetings. But this recommendation kind of follows the way in which actuarial audits are completed and communicated to the board. So in this particular case, what this would do is this would allow for, this is a suggestion that the report be provided to the board. The board review that, whether it's a presentation at a board meeting, and then they provide a formal acknowledgement that they've received it, as well as any additional comments that they want to make regarding the evaluation that was completed. And then finally, what actions the board has already completed or is anticipating to make based on the recommendations within the evaluation. So in that particular case, we have had some evaluations where changes were made during the process of the evaluation itself. So while the process was ongoing, the evaluator made a recommendation, the board acted immediately and made those changes almost immediately. And then to some degree, that change kind of got lost in the process, and it wasn't as highlighted within the evaluation. So it's nice to know that one, that those actions have already been taken. I think it's useful for stakeholders to see that their board is being proactive and responding to the recommendations that are being made. And then this allows any additional stakeholders for actions that have not been taken yet to know that the board is considering them. If the board plans on incorporating those recommendations, or if they, for some reason, have decided they don't want to, it allows the stakeholders to know what plans are forthcoming as well. there's no questions, I'll go ahead and move on to slide 23. So this one is a little bit different. I don't think we've had a complete conversation about this during our last board meeting. This kind of arose from general conversations and general discussion surrounding this requirement itself. So I would note that, this recommendation is that the firm conducting the evaluation should not necessarily be the existing investment consultant, the individual who has helped the board itself develop the policies, procedures, and practices that they're currently following, in part because one of the things that seems to be occurring is that a lot of these investment consultants are, for lack of a better phrase, reviewing their own work. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and I'm not trying to imply that they are not doing a good job of and being objective in identifying what's still working and what changes need to be made. But there could be a perception of a lack of independence in some of these cases. And so from that perspective, we looked at how some other things that are similar to this currently operate, as well as how they have been outlined in the past. So one thing we noted is that there is a similar process for reviewing actuarial work, and there is a requirement that not the governing body, but the sponsoring entity is required to engage an independent actuary to review all of the evaluations and the work that the systems actuary has completed in the last 5 years. So that also involves the sponsors responsible for hiring that actuary, and also the definition of independent doesn't allow for the existing actuary to be the one to review that work, right? So there's that definition of independence within that specific legislative section. And then there's also have been other similar investment evaluation laws in existence prior to SB 322. So specifically for TRS and Houston plans, those laws required an independent third party who was not the existing investment consultant prior to the passage of SB 322. So this was a shift to some degree in how these occur. And so we think that it may not be a bad idea to reconsider that. And if you put the responsibility a little bit more on the sponsoring entity as opposed to on the system itself, it gives a little bit more distance to allow for that independence and that allow for that independence a little bit. And it's important to keep in mind that the sponsors themselves have a vested interest in making sure that the investments are the decisions are being made in accordance with industry best practices, and everything is being done in the best way possible. So they are making large contributions to this, and sometimes the level of governance that they have expressed, not the level of governance, the level of decision-making power or their involvement is somewhat limited. So this provides an opportunity to, I guess, at least get a better sense of how things are going. I mean, almost always, I can't think of any cases where the city does not have some representation, so they should be aware of what's going on. But this, again, provides another level of ability to bring transparency to the process and allow this to continue going forward.
Okay.
So if anyone has any questions.
Committee members, any questions on the legislative recommendations?
Mr. Chairman, I have one question. So on recommendation number 4 in the first sentence, from what I think I understand is that is a, instead of a may not, that is a should not, or is that a strict prohibition?
I think that was probably a sloppy wording on my part. That's probably a, should not, but that's, you know, that's yeah, generally, right, these are, at the moment, these are not, these are suggestions, right? These are here for you all to discuss and make determination if you think they are valuable recommendations that could be made to the legislature. So it wasn't, yeah, may or should would be up to what you all think is most appropriate.
Yeah, I think should would just clarify what you're trying to, the recommendation, because the may not sounds like a prohibition. I just wanted to
Sherry,
clarify.
too, Ms. Shivers. So I think based on the conversations that we had last investment committee, the concern was that there was a conflict of interest that would be desired to be eliminated, and that if we did not clarify in statute whether or not it was permissible for an existing service provider to evaluate their own work, then we would need it to be may not. If we desired as a committee and as a big board to state that it is discouraged, then we certainly could utilize the language of should not. And ultimately, it's going to be a determination of whether or not we feel comfortable that the independence is something that was really important to us, or if it's okay if an existing service provider effectively is policing themselves as opposed to providing that, you know, that independent third-party review, which is similar to what the actuarial process requires, which is, and I believe that that statute says may not utilize the existing. It must be an independent actuary, et cetera. So certainly before anything went to the legislature, it would be clarified, and then ultimately they would, you know, help determine exactly what the final language was. But I think we have to decide as a committee and then as a big board if we want it to be a discouragement or a prohibition, if you will.
Thank you both.
Mr. Chairman, I have no questions, and I appreciate the work of staff and the presentation that Kenny's made.
Likewise. Very, very good stuff, and appreciate the follow through on our last meeting. In order to provide the opportunity, we want to now take public comments regarding these proposed legislative recommendations. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes, and we ask you to please state your name prior to providing your comment. Ashley, if you will open the floor for comment from those participating.
Sure. If anybody is on the telephone, I think it is *6 if you'd like to speak, and unmute yourself.
I want to make sure we leave enough time for technology, but I'm not hearing anybody that wishes to comment, which is totally fine. Last call for comments. So with none, the chair entertains a motion to direct staff to draft potential legislative recommendations for improvements to investment practices and performance evaluation statute, incorporating input agreed upon by the committee for consideration for the full board at its November 12th meeting. Do I have a motion?
I will so move.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
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 The ayes have it. Kenny, I know we have one additional slide in your section, and then we want to update on correspondence, but I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Thank you. I actually have a couple more things to go through. So the first, so the next section of the report is really going to be recommendations that we are making for the systems themselves. And so we kind of, as I mentioned earlier, we have identified some broad themes throughout evaluations that have come both from recommendations for improvement, as well as the items that are highlighted for some plans as strengths, things that they have been doing well, right? We think that some of these can be utilized by other systems. They're good potential ways in which other systems may be able to improve their practice beyond what they're currently doing now. And I do want to note that we're not suggesting that these are recommendations to the legislature to require the systems to do these. These are things that we think can be educational for existing boards to learn from and perhaps incorporate within their own practices. So some of those things, we have had numerous conversations, not just as an investment committee, but throughout the past number of years through our the things that we have identified in our own intensive reviews that we have discussed in various meetings for one reason or another when having conversations with plans about how they are, what they are doing and how they are performing. So one of the things that we've noted in our examples is considering the use of passive versus active investments where appropriate in order to limit your fees, or in order to to change in which how you consider how you are deciding what to invest in. There are a number of recommendations which I think we noted in our last meeting that were related to enhanced documentation and disclosure. So there were multiple recommendations, and I believe Mr. Brainerd commented on the fact that it would be extremely useful for plans to document how much passive versus active investments they are utilizing, and that would be a useful disclosure that they could include. We have found a number of different benchmarking tools and identified a number of plans that perhaps are not benchmarking to some degree for some aspects. And one of the items that we have noted is that it's much more common for benchmarking gross returns as opposed to net of fees, which is something we have commented on in different reviews. And so while the use of active investments is certainly can certainly produce additional returns, if you're not considering the actual cost of those, sometimes it may look like you are getting better returns when once you take into account the actual cost of those, you may not be. So some things like that. And then finally, there is some, we've noted that it is very common for plans to use their assumed rate of return as a specified benchmark for so their actuarial assumed rate of return as a specified investment benchmark. And one of the things that has been published by a number of papers illustrating that can potentially lead to additional risk taking in order to achieve that target. The American Academy of Actuaries has published an article this past summer that talks about the best way to develop the assumed rate of return, and generally that starts with developing your asset allocation first. And so we want to talk about a good process for determining what risk levels are being taken within the asset allocation, ways in which you can consider the risk that's being taken instead of utilizing your assumed rate of return as your target and focusing on that when determining the asset allocation. So that's the last bullet, which seems to be the most involved. We'll include some discussion along those lines. And I think I missed the investment fee considerations, which was really it falls in with disclosure, benchmarking. There's a lot of aspects of how to consider the investment fees that are being included. And again, these are the items that we have identified through reviewing the evaluations, through conversation and we're more than open if you know the committee members or board members have suggestions on what other items may be worth exploring and providing additional education or discussion within the report itself. We'd be happy to take those recommendations.
Any comments or questions in this regard?
Mr. Chairman, this is Keith Brainerd. I have a question or two, please.
Please.
I want to be sure I understand what staff is suggesting here. Kenny, are y'all suggesting that some of these examples, such as say passive versus active investments, would be suggested or recommended disclosures in these evaluations, but not necessarily required by statute?
Correct. So all of the recommendations that we are considering, that we've identified for the systems, would be more along the lines of guidance from the PRB, as opposed to a suggestion for a requirement, a legislative requirement placed on the system itself.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My concern is that in certain cases, I want to be able to see this information. And if we leave it merely as guidance, we may not see it, at least universally. And I would be interested in staff's thoughts about the appropriate venue, namely this committee or the full board, where I could suggest certain areas for additional required disclosure as opposed to guidance.
I think that's, Manu, if you want to go ahead and jump in.
Thank you. Mr. Brainerd, we can certainly look into the option of engaging in rulemaking. That is within the board's purview to do if there are certain areas coming out of this new requirement that the board so wishes to ask the systems to include in their evals moving forward. The board can consider engaging in rulemaking and providing or requiring systems to include those additional disclosures in their evaluations.
Anu, does rulemaking allow, well, is a rule tantamount to a statute? Do we get the same outcome?
So the rulemaking process requires public entities to engage with the systems as we consider those rules. And it does have more authority, and of course, Sherry can comment more on that, but it has more authority compared to providing guidance or recommendations to the systems. And as part of our statute, the board has the rulemaking authority, a blanket rulemaking authority to implement the various mandates under Chapter 802 to also clarify the law for the systems. So the rulemaking authority can be used in a number of ways, one of which is if the board in implementing a requirement, and in this case, a new requirement, feels that there should be additional disclosures that these evaluations should include to implement the intent of the law more fully, then the board can engage in rulemaking in trying to accomplish that, and it has the effect of the law essentially, and it's a more public process where the board engages with the systems themselves, solicits input before adopting those rules.
May I jump in? This is Sherry Shivers. Anu's right. We do that. The PRB does have the authority to implement the statute, but I think Mr. Brainerd was alluding to the fact that by rulemaking, if the PRB engages in rulemaking to add these additional disclosures, that's at high likelihood of exceeding the authority that was granted under statute. And for the PRB to add these things, the statute may be needed to be amended to give the PRB the authority to require this. That's probably a question for the legal
Right.
counsel, but it's just a high likelihood.
So this
So
is
we can
Kenny. Go ahead, Amin.
we can certainly look into that. So if there are areas, for example, the recommendations that the board is going to consider for the systems, if there are areas pertaining to benchmarking or enhanced documentation that goes back to the 5 broad categories that are laid out in the statute, we can talk to our AG counsel and see if those additional disclosures that you would like to see in those 5 categories, if that can be done through rulemaking, or in fact, we need to go back to the legislature to ask for more clarification. So we can get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Let me just finish by clarifying. I'm interested in the what's and not the hows. I'll leave the hows to the attorneys. But ultimately, as one member of the PRB, there are certain disclosures listed here that I would like to receive as a member of this board. And whether or not that's best accomplished through rulemaking or statute, I'm indifferent. I just want to be sure that we're able to look at that information. Thank you.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. Other comments or questions? Kenny, please continue.
Okay, so I'll make one more comment here, Keith, just to one other consideration is that, I mean, as a board member, you have the opportunity to make legislative recommendations, right? So you can suggest those to the committee members and to the board itself for discussion. So if it's something that you feel is sufficiently strong that would be better within legislation, then it can go along with the other recommendations that that we have included with respect to the evaluation law itself. We did not include any because our intent was to focus on the evaluations and how the evaluations are performed and the information that's being communicated. So I think that's up to you. That opportunity is something that you can consider as well. Okay, so I'll move on to the final piece of this particular section is the summaries that we have put together. So I said we have 3 different examples, I think, in here. I can't remember if we included 3 or 4, but so we have a couple of examples. And so I just want to give you a better understanding of how we're structuring these. So the intent is, I believe we said we have 57 evaluations that we are including within this report to the legislature ultimately. And so the intent is that we will have 57 different summaries of the evaluations themselves. That way, someone can read this summary, get a better sense of the evaluation itself without having to go, read through some of these, which are, 150, 200 pages long, right? So they can be a bit dense for some of them. So we're trying to provide a high-level overview of what's included. And so the first section that we've labeled PRB Analysis of Evaluation. This is the only place within the summaries where the PRB is making comments, right? So we provide a little bit of a explanation of how the evaluation is structured, items that we found that were of particular note, either good or bad. So there's some good things that we want to highlight, some items that maybe raise concern, and then try and kind of explain and provide an example maybe of how we have drawn our own conclusion with respect to how the evaluation is structured. So once we move beyond this paragraph and we get into these statements, so the investment policy statements are basically the boxes that are on the next few pages. And we maybe need to highlight the very last sentence immediately preceding these boxes, but everything below this, all of these boxes are specifically coming from the evaluation themselves. So we are not, where it says recommendations, these are not PRB recommendations. These are things that the evaluators themselves have noted as the recommendations, or in this particular case, as strengths, right? So all of these words are, if not verbatim, almost verbatim from the evaluation themselves. So none of this is really the summary of the evaluation that we're providing. And the point, the idea that we're trying to get across here, or the things that we're trying to include, are basically the highlights or the key points that we think that the evaluation is making. And so that's the
Kenny,
goal
if
is
I may,
to I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Ashley, if you'll jump back to 26 for me, please. So it is exactly one of the comments that I wanted to make. Is what I would strongly prefer and suggest is the statement that says the following table presents key points identified by the evaluator. I don't know if we bold it, underlined it, italicize it, what we do, but to make it very, very clear, this is not PRB staff's recommendations to these plans. It is a summation of the recommendation, or a listing of the recommendations as provided by the evaluator. I think it's really important. And when we have members of the legislature who pick this up, once every 2 years, we want to make sure they remember that as they're reviewing these, particularly also for the constituents of these various plans, that they don't misunderstand that this is, our opinions. This is just a restatement. So if we can find a way to make that really clear, I'd appreciate it.
We will definitely work on that and make sure it's more clear. And again, we are presenting the way in which we've structured these now. We're more than open to any suggestions or recommendations. And one of the other things that if you'll note, we have in the plan, in the box in the upper right corner, we've kind of included the 4 items that were identified in the guidance for investment practices and performance evaluation that we published last year, because we thought it was useful to indicate whether each of these items were actually included. And so this kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier. One of the recommendations we made with respect to I guess including the disclosure requirements within the law itself, as opposed to within PRB guidance. And if there are no additional questions, I think we can, that's all I have for this section of the agenda.
I will tell you, Kenny and the rest of the team, these are outstanding, very quick reads and very understandable. So I really appreciate the effort that everybody has put into these, because it will save everybody a tremendous amount of time and give us really the meat of what we need to have, very, very quickly. So thank you for that. Any other questions or comments on that section?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to second your comments that I think the PRB staff has done an excellent job going through the volume of materials and summarizing it in this way. It's very helpful.
Thank you for that.
Mr. Chairman, likewise, I'll chime in, and I'll go a step further and encourage retirement systems in the state to review this information. There's a lot of meat here. As you said, there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of good information here that funds can pick up, especially from larger funds that have greater resources. Thank you.
Great.
And
thank you both.
Before we move on, I do want to note that I think we as staff members have found a significant amount of information and education from reading these. Some of these have been produced in a way that are extremely educational for people who have been doing this for many years. So I think it's turned out to be a very helpful requirement. And I think that we're going to learn a lot about how systems themselves are performing, and potentially quite a bit about turning those into ways in which they those systems can make improvements as well. So I think this has been a very good learning experience on my part going through these. So it's been a difficult but enjoyable experience.
It'll become a rhythm, and that will help everybody and allow everybody to benefit from best practices. So, believe we're on 5D. Is that right, regarding correspondence? Ashley, if I saw that correctly.
Yes. So we have had a couple of conversations, I believe, investment committee meetings discussing the amount of information that's included in some of the evaluations or the lack thereof, specifically with respect to evaluations that did not include recommendations and how they drew those conclusions. So the committee had asked staff to reach out to plans that had evaluations that didn't have as much detail to express potential concern and request that they consider making some enhancements to their evaluations. So we reached out to a number of systems. We've had discussions with both systems as well as their consultants or the firms that have been performing the evaluations. Everyone has been fairly receptive to the idea of making additional changes. So many of them have been listening to the conversations, to the investment committee conversations. And so as far as we are aware, many of those are in process. It's not something that they have been able to turn around immediately, and those conversations have taken some time. So we are aware that at least some of them are in process. I don't have a listing of who is and is not intending to make changes, but I would say that everyone that I have spoken to has been fully receptive of making the changes as necessary.
Thank you for that. And please keep us updated on the progress there. Any other questions from the committee members?
No, thank you.
Okay. So we have not determined the next investment committee date. We'll obviously advise everyone once that has been set. And we'll give one more opportunity for anyone in the audience that would like to have comments that they would like to present to the committee at this time. I believe *6 is the way to do that. So we'll give just a minute. Okay, if there's no further business and no objection, the chair will move to adjourn this meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
The meeting is adjourned. Staff, thank you so much for making this process go as smooth as it has. Everybody stay safe, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, members.